Hello and welcome to Writing is Personal. I'm Susan Tomaselli, writer-in-resident at Maynooth University, and I'm joined this evening by Darran Anderson. Darran Anderson is the author of the acclaimed Inventory that's just come out in paperback and named the Observer's Book of the Week. Also the author of Imaginary Cities, published by Influx Press, and that was chosen as the best book of 2015 by the Financial Times, The Guardian, the AV Club and other publications. His writing has appeared in The Atlantic, the Times Literary Supplement, Frieze and Wired. He's given talks at the V&A, the London School of Economics, Melbourne's Robin Boyd Foundation and the Venice Biennale. For my money, Inventory is a brilliant haunting and haunted meditation on trauma and on place, of people drowning at sea in the foil and flailing on dry land, of ordinary people and their things in extraordinary circumstances. It's a litany of heartache. I may be slightly biased, as I've known Darran for some years now, so don't trust me. Here's Sean O'Hagan writing in The Guardian. He says, Inventory is a book of hard-won truths, a detailed map of a journey out of the labyrinth, the maze of memories, anecdotes, evasions, and secrets that families construct in an attempt to protect themselves and those who come after them. It is also inevitably, but not exclusively, a book about the Troubles, a time when, to paraphrase Joan Didion, people told themselves stories in order to survive. After a time, those stories, endlessly repeated, become a form of myth-making or denial, or both. The real stories, painful, exposing, were often shrouded in silence. In often radical ways, this is a book about breaking that silence, transgressing what Seamus Heaney called the tight gag of place, but also of family. A book of revelations then, both large and small. Its truths reverberate in the imagination long after you finish reading it. Darran, I want to start with Georges Perec. He's a figure who looms quite largely over this book, but before we do, I don't think we can talk about objects without mentioning John Berger's ways of saying, and in particular, that quote, "We never look at one thing, we're always looking at the relation between things and ourselves." Darran, initially, when I heard that you were writing a book on objects inspired by Georges Perec, maybe you'll explain who Perec is. I first of all thought of his novel Les Choses, Things, a novel of the 60s. And then when you said it was going to be a story of the Troubles, I thought of W, or The Memory of Childhood. That's his, for those who haven't read it, semi-autobiographical novel on losing his family in the Holocaust. But reading Inventory last year, it made sense to me that it was neither of those books and both of those books and another strand from Perec as well. How did you come to Georges Perec?
Well, I find my method of writing is I'm a real sort of bibliomaniac, I guess. So all of my work it's all about place, and it's all about, cities and architecture and things, but it's also about, it's kind of books about books. I was a really bookish kid, and I escaped a lot in my imagination through books, ever since picking up a copy of Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnap, which just manifested itself in the house. We didn't really have anything in our house, but it was there. Maybe it was there when we moved in, or I don't know how it ended up there, but ever since I've just been obsessed with books. And I find as a writing aid, I like to bounce off writers, writers from before our time, not really contemporary writers so much. Although there's a lot of great contemporary writers, but I just feel like I like the time travel and the clairvoyance of writing. So for Imaginary Cities, I bounced off Calvino, particularly Calvino's book, Invisible Cities. And for this one, I think Calvino led me to Perec, because they were both members of Aleppo, and they were both kind of experimental, but really accessible as well, which is kind of my sweet spot. I don't like things to be too sort of indulgent or cloistered, or academic. I really want to kind of write things that anyone I think coming from a kind of autodidact background, and I was working class and still am working class, all of the books I read they weren't given to me in syllabuses or curriculums. They were things I accidentally found or someone passed on. So Perrick, I think he came about because of Calvino, and I just followed that thread. And initially there was a lot of resistance there because I thought of him as a kind of prankster or a sort of neo-Dadaist, you know, bullshit artist, basically, which he was a little bit. But
yeah, he was in I suppose Aleppo was a deck of jokers, but he was probably one of the brightest.
Yeah, and I think his background was so tragic, although he doesn't come across, you know, he wore that very lightly, which also interested me as well, because I wanted to write about terrible things that happened in my family and community. But I wanted to do it with a lightness of touch, which really, really appealed to me. The more I learned of Perrick, you know, his mother was murdered in the Holocaust. His father died fighting the Germans, and he grew up this orphan. And so I'd put him in a box kind of as this avant-garde trickster figure. And then I was reading Avoid. I was reading some criticisms around his book it's translated as Avoid. And the criticism was saying that it's a book that's written entirely without the letter E. So initially I have a real resistance to books like that because they're very, you know, they're gimmicky and whatever. But there was a critic wrote about it, and he said that, he pointed out that because of the absence of the letter E, Perrick was unable to write his own name. He was unable to write the French words for mother and father. He was unable to write the French word for writer. And I thought, there's something magnificent there. He's writing about absences and subtexts and, you know, the iceberg beneath the waves. And that was what I kind of wanted to do. So I followed down that route. I was already interested in objects through kind of reading Walter Benjamin and reading Freud, and the sort of idea of objects as a tool of telling stories and approaching stories that are too painful or problematic to approach directly, or too dangerous. And if you do it through the conduit of an object, you can come at it kind of sideways, and people will drop their guard, and you won't all the kind of routines and patterns that we fall into. For example, polemic. So if you're writing something, my background is working class Republican background. My sort of channel, I guess, is to fall into that way of thinking and that way of presenting the story, you know, fight for my people kind of thing. And it's a sort of, to me, that's like, all polemic is kind of like diving into the shallow end of the pool. So Perrick enabled me to, he really liberated the book, I think, paradoxically, by restricting it. So I had to write about these objects. I couldn't really go outside the lines. And oddly, that's strangely inspiring in a way.
In inventory, there is a lot of horror, as you would expect in a book on the Troubles. And I find the title chapter called Inventory especially difficult. The miniature portraits of the victims, especially the little boy. But there's anger there too, and there's parts where the reader finds that anger welling up. And I'm thinking in particular of the Needles wedding dress chapter.
Yeah.
That aside, there's also a lot of humor in Inventory, as in Perrick. And I'm thinking of the boys riding in their Sunday best suits. You mentioned it briefly there, but how difficult was it? You mentioned Perrick's lightness of hand, but how difficult was it for you to weight the book, or did you weight it? On how did you put emphasis on particular moments?
I think part of it's already there from, you'll know yourself from growing up in the North. There's a sense of, no matter how bleak it was, like, people are just wonderful storytellers and joke tellers, and the crack is always like at the forefront of everything, to the extent where it's used as a sort of distraction, and it's used to as a way of not talking about the truth, you know, of diverting the truth. And so the truth becomes this thing that can't be said, and is all glances and nudges and winks and reading between the lines. So there's always that balance in the North, I think, of humor as almost as a form of resistance, you know, a life affirmation, but it's always very much with the brutality of what was going on, and the sort of depressingness of what was going on. You know, it was, you have to balance these things. It doesn't go well. It's not true to life to go too far in one direction. And I think it even, in some ways, you know, like you could see Inventory as a kind of anti-colonial book or a post-colonial book in a sense. You know, it's extremely angry about what happened in the North. And, you know, it lays blame squarely at certain doors. But if you're just motivated by anger and the brutality of things, that's a distortion, you know, of life. And there has to be something where, you know, you have to be struggling for a reason. And for me, the reason is not just, you know, acknowledging the beauty in life, and acknowledging that you have a debt to future generations. You know, you have a debt to your child. And even if you don't have children, you have a debt to the world to come, like some kind of envisaging some kind of better world that you didn't necessarily have, or your parents didn't have, or your grandparents. So I think that debt is the thing that weighs heavily on you, and you end up constantly correcting yourself, I guess. The moment I kind of land on an opinion as well, like it might be morbid, or it might be sort of very positive. I don't know if it's the writer in me or the contrarian or whatever, but like I just start doubting it immediately. You know, the minute I start feeling something, I start instantly doubting it. And I guess that's a bad trait to have as an individual, but I think it can be useful as a writer. I have an innate suspicion of writers that are too certain about things and have a very fixed position, you know, a very fixed ideology or a very fixed worldview. Because I think we operate best when we're turning things around from different angles, and we're almost kind of examining things from, and again, I guess the objects fit into this, you know, looking at it from different perspectives, and not just spatial perspectives as well, but temporal, you know, because time invests like meaningless objects with stories and character and this aura that, you know, Benjamin writes about. So yeah, I guess it's you're always balancing and rebalancing. I definitely, there was a book that didn't come out called Tide Rack, and I feel like it was darker, and I think that's possibly one of the reasons it didn't come out. And for that, I researched all the deaths and the troubles extensively, and I felt like the Nietzsche quote about, you know, staring into the abyss and the abyss stares back. I ended up like having sleep disorders and, you know, drinking too much, and I realized that seeing the world through that prism of kind of violence is not actually realistic, just as much as, you know, seeing the world as all unicorns and positivity is distorting as well. You know, you have to get a balance of the two. If either means anything, it's you know, you can only tell lightness and darkness by contrasting one against the other. So that's what I tried to do.
You say quite early on in the book, actually, you relate a story of when you cracked your head as a baby, and you had absolutely no memory of that incident, as you know, most babies wouldn't, until that day you went to shave your head and the scar there, and it's been underneath there all along. And that reminded me of a line from one of your early poems, from Tesla's Ghost, the Resurrectionist, which is about Gravediggers, but it goes like, I'm sorry, I've written it down because my memory is terrible. Ideal in resurrection, a public service, for death's a trade like everything else. Is that what you found about writing this book, that it was an act of resurrection? Uncovering scars, or how difficult did you find it for people to relate their stories?
I mean, it's difficult. To answer your second point first, it's difficult not just through silence. You would expect silence to be the main thing that you run into, but you don't actually. What you run into initially is people have constructed other stories to cover up the real, the painful story. And that's difficult because it leads to, it really calls into question your kind of conscience as a writer, because you may be bringing out a trauma in these people. It may be very unhelpful to uncover these scars, because then you just leave and go on with your life, and the book comes out and you're leaving them with whatever they've dug up is still there, and whatever coping mechanism they might have formed in the last few decades, you've kind of potentially disrupted. So I don't know how successful I was, but I made a promise to myself that I would take on as much of the weight of the book and as much of the cost of the book and not transfer it onto other people. I work in journalism, and I hear journalists, very famous journalists, say stuff like, oh, everything is copy. And while that may well be true, just saying that alone, I think is, it negates the responsibility that you have to have when you're dealing with people's lives and people's traumas. So I felt like when you dig into these things, you have to be sure, like, if you're finding things that you want to find, then you're digging in the wrong place. If you're finding things that are painful for other people, then you have to handle them very, very carefully. And you have to be, extremely responsible, which is tricky, because it often means burying the stories that you find. And you think to yourself, oh, this is amazing. The amount of things I've found for inventory that could never make it into the book, confessional things that would have just exploded people's lives, exploded my life, and would have had like serious repercussions. And I know other writers would have included them, but you can't. You have, you're a person with a conscience first and foremost, and then you're a writer, I think, and maybe people say it the other way around, but I feel like if it doesn't hurt, I mean, you try and take it on yourself, but if it doesn't hurt, to kind of paraphrase a Robert Capa quote, if it doesn't hurt, you're not digging deep enough. I really, really feel like to examine things in Northern Ireland where there's been a conspiracy of silence for so long, and just to examine the sort of traumas of working class life and growing up in poverty universally across the world, no matter what background you are, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, whatever. These things are going to be painful. So all you can hope for is that you can do it in a way that has a long-term benefit to someone. And we'll see if that's, I don't know if that's the case with inventory. I've had some good responses from people who said that it brought closure in certain topics. And then I have other family members who haven't broke breath to me since I wrote it, and probably won't. So there's always a cost, and I guess that's, it's in the eye of the beholder what, how painful it is reading things. I know for, I mean, I think I've mentioned this before in talks, but I got a taxi journey one time in Glasgow where my son was living in Glasgow with his mother, and I got a taxi journey. I was living in London, and I came up the same, and I was getting a taxi back to the train. And the taxi man noticed my accent and said, he was a Scottish guy, and he said, oh, you're from Northern Ireland? And I was like, aye. And he goes, whereabouts? And I said, Derry. And we got on to chat about the north, and he said, "Oh, I know it well. I know the place well because I served there in the 70s or 80s." And then we had this sort of like typical to and fro, saying I was probably throwing stones at you. He was in the British Army. I was probably throwing stones at you, and my older members of my family were doing God knows what. But whenever we pulled up at the train station after having this really nice chat and sort of slagging each other, he burst into tears as I was getting out of the taxi. And you're talking to a man who's well into his 50s, might be even older. And I didn't have time to stay. I don't think I could have consoled him in any way. It was really, really uncomfortable. But, I sort of made my excuses and left and went and grabbed a train. And I was thinking about it the whole way down to London, that the amount of trauma that has happened in Northern Ireland, not just from people who were involved, but bystanders, family members, the sons and daughters of, all the people that were affected. It hasn't gone away. Like, it's still there underneath, and all the panaceas that we put on top, they haven't addressed it. There's been no Truth and Reconciliation program in Northern Ireland. And, as a writer, I was really conscious of not writing down a lot of the stuff that was told to me in case, my house gets raided and my hard drives get taken, so we're at that stage where there's still this omerta, and what Heaney called, whatever you say nothing. It still largely exists, and people are like, "Oh, don't rock the boat. We're getting Game of Thrones. We're getting tourism. Belfast is buzzing," all this kind of talk. And I've pitched articles, with my journalist hat on, like, I've pitched articles to major publications in Britain in the last few years saying we're sitting on a time bomb with Northern Ireland. I know these areas and the working class areas, and they're going to explode, and was constantly getting them shot down. I never got one article published. And now, of course, they're exploding, and it's not going to go away. So I think it's because these matters aren't addressed, and if we can address them through art and culture, I don't think that writers should necessarily have an obligation to do anything except write. But I think as human beings, we might have a kind of moral duty to, the people who've died and their families to remember, and to, at the very least, say, like, this thing happened. This happened to this person. So I think that was one of my driving forces with Inventory, was just to say this happened, because I think that's enough, like, just to objectively put it down, because although the past is objective, memory is subjective, which is another theme of the book and another theme of Perrick. So things that happen can get swept away, and we can reimagine history and we can rewrite it and all the rest. And very often the people that bear the cost of that are the victims.
It's very much, I don't want to say love letter, but Derry's another character, or Derry's, I should say. There's multiple Derrys in the book, and what struck me was the book itself is almost like a DeLorean time machine, in that you can zip backwards and forwards through it. The chronology isn't too fixed, and you could potentially read the book out of sequence, like one of those artists' flick books, and you could follow the progression and regression of the city depending on which way you read it. Does that make sense to you? Was that deliberate? As you mentioned, the situation exploding again, as Belfast was burning last week. I read an early incarnation of Inventory from the winter papers. Your essay on that, and the line jumped out at me where you say you'd never been able to escape seeing the world in fragments and from secondary perspectives. So I suppose my question is on the form of the book.
Well, I don't think I can write a chronological book or a linear book. I think it's either beyond me or it doesn't interest me. I'm not quite sure, but I think there's a bit of a lie going on, you know, when you've got a nice cozy 5-act structure or 3-act structure. I think that's part of a lie, and I'm increasingly, as I get older, increasingly frustrated and have less and less time for that kind of story, especially when it's done in movies, you know, in Hollywood. That format to me is actually very damaging and redundant. So I write the way I see life, which is in fragments and constantly changing, quite sort of protean. It's constantly changing. So, and constantly contextual as well. So the person that you were today is different from the person you were yesterday. And memory to me doesn't come chronologically. It comes in fragments. It comes in like, it's often sparked by, you know, in a kind of Proustian way, it's sparked by smell or taste or hearing certain song or finding objects. And then something will just bubble up from the depths. So I thought that was a truer way, even though there's a degree of artifice with it. I thought that was a truer way of writing about life than a linear narrative, which to me always seems contrived. And I guess inventory is a sort of collection of a collection. So it's a kind of cabinet of curiosities in the form of a series of almost like little short vignettes. And Imaginary Cities has that, as you know, has a certain form as well, where it's, I tried to do it like a city where it's a sprawling kind of beast, you know, but you can only really dig into that book in fragments. You know, it's a difficult book to read from beginning to end, just the way, and that's intentional because it's supposed to be the way a city, you experience a city in little glimpses. And there's ideas of contingency and simultaneity that are in both of the books. You know, it could have been different. We were only seeing one side of it. We were only seeing our little bit. So I guess that's the way I live and think. And therefore, it's not really, it's an unconscious decision rather than a conscious one. You know, it's sort of the only way I can write. But that makes it extremely hard to operate in publishing, to be honest, because every book is therefore a hard sell, you know, and publishers want something that has a 5-act structure, and they want something that has redemption and reconciliation and, you know, a journey and a nice little morality tale. Yeah. And it always just reminds me of like Tycho and our DeLorean machine. It reminds me of those cartoons in the 80s where you had like Dungeons and Dragons or Captain Planet or something like that. And they had this story arc. And then at the end, you got told the moral. You get told it's something to go away with. And again, I'm skeptical of these things. You know, I'm skeptical about the idea of even literature as an empathy machine, which seems to be very popular at the minute. I think literature, I think when literature starts talking, writers start talking about it in those terms, I think they're almost like fighting in retreat, like they've given up territory. I think we should just assume that the very act of writing itself is an empathetic act. You're seeing inside the head of someone else. You're seeing the world through their eyes. But to call it an empathy machine, it seems to me like, you know, the lady doth protest too much. It's trying to justify writing when it doesn't need justified. And I feel like we should be fighting by gaining more and more new territory, by really seeing how far we can push this thing, and not just settling on this idea that there's a cozy idea, oh, you know, which always leads to this sort of cozy writing that is actually quite dishonest in terms of like life is brutal at times, you know, like, I don't know about other people, but it's merciless at times. And that's also why it's kind of beautiful, because you get these moments of beauty. And, you know, I feel like, and, you know, I guess it's perspective as well. I gravitate towards things like Bergman and Dostoevsky and, you know, weighty, depressing art. So I mightn't be the best person to ask about any of these things, but I just write the way I live and think, and that is fragmentary, you know. And maybe there's an element of, I can't remember the exact quote, you know, but the famous Eliot quote about these fragments I shore up against my ruin. I think that's almost certainly the case with me. It's an attempt to make sense of things and to stop myself sliding into the chaos, which I absolutely have a tendency to do. But yeah, that's, I don't have a real choice on how I write.
It's almost back to going back to John Berger again. There's a source of quotes, but in ways of saying, where he says the photographer's way of seeing is reflected in his choice of subject, the painter's way of seeing reconstituted by the marks he makes on the canvas. Is that fair to say in relation to your work? What's the writer's way of seeing?
Yeah, I think so. You have to be careful as well, though, that your way of seeing, and Berger's very, very good on this, your way of seeing has its own distortions and its own biases. And those might be, you know, we're in a very politicized time at the minute, but I tend to push a wee bit beyond that. I think that it's more psychological. A lot of this stuff, you know, it masquerades as politics and it masquerades as social commentary and everything. But I think those things exist, of course, but I think we often don't know our intentions, and we don't know our biases, and we tell ourselves convenient, comfortable stories that, you know, we're doing certain things in our work. You know, I was talking to Max Porter recently, and a subject came up where, you know, someone said something along the lines of like, why did you write the book? And I have the reasons that I tell myself that I wrote the book, but those probably aren't the reasons. You know, like, I'm probably enacting some form of revenge or some form of self-aggrandizing. Who knows? You know, I don't trust the reasons that I'm telling myself. And I think that that can be a liberating thing. You know, Empiric is very, very good on this as well. He doesn't tell you the obvious, and he doesn't tell you what you want to hear. There's little tricks in there, and I guess that's the positive role of the trickster. It's to take a lot of the assumptions and call out the emperor's new clothes. And we should have that interior voice, you know, the little cricket and Pinocchio that's telling us what we don't want to hear. I think, yeah, the perspective's interesting. I walk around sometimes, you know, usually the worst writing comes from walking around with your writer glasses on. You know, walking around London thinking, oh, how could I describe this scene? How could I, you know, I'm on the tube, I'm wandering about and it's totally deserted. How could I describe this? And it always kind of turns into this awful pastiche of psychogeography, you know, really overblown. And I'm learning more and more to be wary of those moments where you see the world through a writer's eyes. I like the moments where they just steal upon you and you can't do anything about it. And you wake up in the middle of the night with a thought that you don't want to have. And then you realize, oh, there's something here. There's something much deeper going on. And I think that comes from reading writers like, I'm increasingly drawn to Dostoevsky, who's an odd influence because it's nothing like what I'm writing. But he really never let the reader get comfortable or let himself get comfortable. He never, as far as I'm aware, he never took the position of the writer as a kind of saint or a kind of activist or whatever it happens to be. I like the times where there's a voice in your head that you don't want to hear, and you're compelled to write about it. It's not an act. It's not a decision.
Well, the voice in my head is asking me to invite you to read something. Would that be okay?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it from inventory?
Yeah. I'll read a little short chapter. That's called Torch. It's about the house that I lived in that we grew up in Cedar Street in Derry. It's an old Victorian house. Yeah, it's just called Torch. In the living room under the stairs was an impossibly dark space that my parents called the spider cupboard. It contained a perpetual fragment of night when the door was closed. It enveloped anyone who entered, and even when your eyes accustomed to it, there was minimal vision. You could feel the darkness. You could not see your hand in front of your face. The air tasted faintly of coal. Everything became still in there. It was as if the walls of the house had fallen away and you were standing in an infinite, starless, cosmic black, and it would take all your nerve to remain there for long. One day, someone locked me in there. Everyone has their breaking point, and as I finally snapped and pounded on the door to be let out, I could hear laughter through the door, and the panic rose in my chest. I was frantic before they relented, and I spilled out onto the carpet, reaching for my inhaler. Even when the door was open and the light was shining in, it did not penetrate far, and yet the darkness still lured me in. Always a hoarder, steptoe, my mother joked. Dad kept a lot of his junk in there, hanging on little hooks and piled up in boxes. Rarely would he throw anything away. The hoarding seemed to be an echo of a deep, lingering habit, a kind of need that went beyond need. I would take my father's torch into the spider cupboard and search through the items. Concert posters, sheet music, strange photographs of groups of young men with their arms around one another, standing in front of rows of lights and wire fences, and photos of family members now deceased, which seemed taboo to even look at, but yet utterly compelling. Turning the torch around close enough to create a halo of light, I could see writing of indeterminate age faintly scrawled in different colors on the stone wall. It was always cold to the touch, like a castle wall. I shone my flickering light along the wooden panels, descending the inverse side of the staircase above. I always dreaded shining the light down into the farthest reaches for fear I'd see something. The darkness there swallowed even the battery's power. I could never see where it ended, or if it ended at all, convincing myself that perhaps it went down into the darkness of a hollow earth, to hell or limbo. And if you did terrible things, or even just questionable things, and who was to know what they were, you'd go there and never be let out. I kept one foot in the doorway at all times, never entirely crossing the threshold.
Thank you. Just a question has popped in. This is probably the time to ask it because I want to talk about one of your other books next. But James Craig wants to know how you feel about being part of the diaspora and how the experience of growing up during the Troubles lives in your world day to day now, and how you feel when you return to Derry.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. The diaspora element is huge. It's very strange because I guess you kind of, there's a real danger falling between the cracks because you're seen here. I've lived in England and Scotland most of my life, longer than I did in Ireland. And you're really seen, you're seen as an Irish writer. And Irish writing's going through such a boom at the minute that you're, I guess you're part of that, but you're not part of it at all. You feel very, very detached from it. And I've had great support from people in Ireland, like yourself and Damien Smith, Lucy Caldwell, Wendy Erskine, fantastic cultural dynamos and writers. So I feel an affinity with people in Ireland, and that's obviously who I am and where I'm from and always will be. But you definitely are. You're in a kind of exile, and I don't want to get too melodramatic about it. It's not like, Ovid or pining over not being able to go back, or Dante or something, but I don't get back very often, and I feel simultaneously immersed in the place always, because it created my whole prism of seeing the world, but also very much detached. You know, I feel like an outsider. And you know, I've said before that I think that might be a useful position, and a useful position like as a person, but also as a writer. I think it's probably useful that to be sort of orbiting something at a distance, rather than being fully involved. But there are moments I get of you feel a terrible kind of solitude, because you have a lot of things that you don't have to talk about with people back home. You know, a lot of like assumptions that they all know, like everyone knows, and you don't have to explain anything. And while I have a lot of great friends, creative friends here, there's so much stuff they don't understand, you know, baseline stuff. So it's a really strange position to be in, and sometimes it's uncomfortable. You know, I romanticize literature, or used to romanticize literature a lot, and always wanted to be part of movements and writing manifestos and creating all these wonderful scenes and, you know, bars and cabarets and all that kind of stuff. And then you realize that you're a different kind of writer, you know, whether you like it or not. You're a writer. You're one of those guys who, or girls who, you know, wander about in forests on their own. And that's fine, I guess. After a certain age, you stop caring as well. So, but as a younger person trying to be a writer, that was really difficult. And now I just see myself as a kind of just a weirdo out in a limb, but an Irish weirdo. There's no getting rid of that. Like, no matter, you know, I have friends who did real kind of culture crunch things and they become amazingly cosmopolitan, which is fine. But, you know, they sort of leave Ireland and they go to Berlin, and they're suddenly no longer Irish. But to me, it's like trying to disown your genetics. You can't do it. So I guess the further away I get from Ireland and the longer away, it might loom even larger and larger. You know, I find myself in nights, there are nights where it's like, you know, landing back from the pub or a nightclub or a gig or something, and sticking on Luke Kelly and the Pogues, and just being a kind of caricature. Yeah. But I guess it's just on you. And yeah, I kind of like, you know, there are people who I interviewed Maggie O'Farrell, actually when I had COVID last year, via the telephone. And, you know, it's interesting me encountering people who are in a similar position, you know, who are Irish or Northern Irish and have been away for a long time. And there's a constellation of us. Some of them are beautiful stars twinkling, you know, like Emer McBride and Maggie. And then there's these black holes like myself, but we're all out there in the universe doing our thing. So it's nice. It's nice to encounter people in the same position.
If I could jump backwards to Imaginary Cities, could you talk just a little bit about that, the origins of that book? Because I suppose the gist of it is that cities are tangible places, but you make a strong case for the human imagination.
Yeah, so I started writing that. I was living in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, and there's a friend of mine's, Chris Kelly, a really good friend of mine's, who he made a film that was nominated for a BAFTA a year or two ago, called The Cambodian Spring, and he was out there for almost a decade, and he was covering this fascinating story of this female protest movement against land grabbing. And so it's a wonderful film which I highly recommend everyone to watch. You know, it's an amazing tale in an amazing place. And I was sort of following him around, carrying his gear, and just having lots and lots of misadventures with him. And I was with another friend of mine's, William Kelly, who's Chris's brother. He's another great friend. And we were up. Now, I thought that we were up, and I've been telling people ever since Imaginary Cities came out that we were on top. We were on the roof of the Foreign Correspondence Club in Phnom Penh. And William told me recently that we weren't. That was totally a false memory. So
Sounds good though.
It was some other place. So yeah, but we were on the roof of this place. So, you know, memory is subjective. And there was this big thunderstorm coming in towards the city, and it was during rainy season, and the river there flows backwards because there's so much rain. And I was just thinking to myself, this is crazy. You know, I was writing all these articles about architecture and cities, and I was trying to write fictional books. And I realized that I was never going to write fiction, that this city that was in front of me was more spectacular than anything I could imagine, any science fiction book that I could invent. And that was the beginning of it. That moment, there was like a light bulb just clicked in my head, and I realized this is what I want to do sort of forever. You know, but take nonfiction and really stretch it, you know, be super creative with it, because the world is endlessly, you know, like that Louis MacNeice thing about, you know, more plural and stranger than we know and stranger than we treat it. So yeah, Imaginary Cities, it came out of that. And again, it wasn't a book I'd intended to write, but it insisted on it. You know, it started forming, very nebulous. And then before I knew it, I was deep into it, and you can't stop. It's sort of like, you don't know who's writing who. It's just takes on a life of its own, which is actually nice when you're writing, when it does that. But it's sort of like, you don't know where it'll lead. But yeah, that was an interesting one. But that book could only work as an indie book. You know, if you try and go up to a mainstream publisher with a book like that, they'll just it won't exist. They will not entertain the idea. So I'm glad that it does exist. It's like this weird little. I said to Max Porter that it was like a fungus that was growing out of control when I was writing it, because the first draft was over 1,000 pages long. I used to carry it around in like a briefcase, and I was like, I don't know what this is. I think it might be a book or a virus of some kind. But we made it look like a book, and people have been really kind about it. And it took me to a lot more cities as well, you know, which now seems so exotic in hindsight because of lockdown. It seems amazing. They follow your book to different places where people are reading it. And again, I think there's a little Ovid. I think it's in Tristia. There's a little quote by Ovid where he's in exile, and he sends off his book, and the opening lines is like, "Go, little book, where I cannot go." And this year's felt a bit like that with Inventory. It's like you're dropping a stone down a bottomless well, and you're trying to listen for the echoes. It's a very odd experience.
Imaginary Cities works extremely well as a book, but I could reimagine it as like this sprawling web network.
Oh yeah,
almost like a choose your own adventure.
Yeah,
you could
the Arcades project was a big influence on it.
That makes sense, actually.
Yeah, and it ran into the same problems that he ran into, Walter Benjamin, where it's this sprawling kind of maelstrom, and it's you have to struggle to fit it into book form. And the version that I have and the notes that I have are, for me, I can't really read the published version, although Influx did a great job on it, because I have these other versions in my head, that are, what was left out is longer than what's there. So yeah, it was a strange experience, and it is a case of that, a work is never finished, it's abandoned. we just had to go, right, we have to stop at 500 pages or 600 pages. But it's still carrying on in my mind. I'm still kind of working on that in some level.
One of the things I love about your work in general is that you drop and pick up and then drop and pick up threads all across all of your books. And there's always these themes and subjects that keep popping up, like maps, radios, transmission, cinema, and Imaginary Cities opens, I think, with the cinematic theme. Before there were films, there was cinema, the flickering shadow play of fire and motion on limestone cave walls. How big an influence is cinema on your writing?
Oh yeah, massively. I mean, it's odd because in a way it's the art form I know least. You know, I spent time as a sort of art writer, so I know about the visual arts to some degree. I'm a music obsessive. I'm an architecture obsessive, and I'm very bookish. But cinema is it's the biggest blind spot I have, and for that reason, I think it sort of looms largest in a way, because I definitely have been more influenced by things outside literature, and I think part of that is a kind of, I don't really have any heroes, but I have a lot of admiration for Walter Gropius of the Bauhaus, and he had this idea, you know, of combining different art forms and disciplines, and that the greatest stuff happens in the translation process between each, and that sort of overlapping between different forms. And I feel it with cinema, because I don't understand cinema, I'm kind of fascinated by it, and I'm always trying to kind of steal from it and translate it into literature in a way that I don't with books so much. So a big influence in inventory was the films of Terence Davies, which I'm just absolutely mesmerized by. And I'm, you know, anyone watching this, go and watch The Long Day Closes. It's just a magnificently beautiful film about nostalgia and grief and becoming an adult. You know, if you like something like Cinema Paradiso, you just go and watch The Long Day Closes, because it's just so much. I'm not going to say better, because all films have their virtues, but that was a massive influence. And yeah, I'm drawn to, because I don't understand it. I guess it's like, I read this thing that, I think it was Samuel L. Jackson, he said that he can't watch a film anymore because he knows, you know, he starts analyzing each scene, so he has no suspension of disbelief. So he'll watch it and he'll go, right, that was shot this way, and the actor stood there, and they did this, and that's the trick. And it's like a magician knowing the trick; they can never fall for it. And I sort of know the trick for most art forms now, but I don't with cinema yet. So that fascinates me. And some of the biggest influences on inventory, the Seventh Seal was a massive one, and not the scenes with death, but there's a little scene where they have this little family, and they're the family of artists who travel in sort of troubadours, and they have a little baby, and the knight meets them, and he has this wonderful, beautiful moment with them, and that was sort of the heart and soul that I was looking to try and approach, if not capture. And then Bergman's later film, Fanny and Alexander, is a sort of follow-up to it feels like a follow-up to the Seventh Seal in a way. That was another massive influence. Tarkovsky, Chris Marker, Agnes Varda. There's so many people, because I guess it still has that magic, because I don't understand it. And I love what happens when you translate scenes. So I guess parts of inventory were written cinematically as if I was seeing it on a screen. And it's a wee bit like that. Oh, I can't remember the name. In Dreams Begin Responsibilities, Delmore Schwartz. There's a short story. He was like the tutor of Lou Reed, and he's a sort of forgotten figure now, but he wrote this story about like his parents and his childhood, and he's watching it like it's on a cinema screen. And I envisaged a lot of the chapters, not necessarily from straight memory, but kind of as if they were, I wrote them as if they were cinematically. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess it's a good tool to have, but maybe it's the way I see the world too. I definitely have a spatial memory. I can walk through rooms that I haven't been in 30 years and see them crystal clear. It's a very odd thing. But at the same time, I don't know what year it is. And, you know, so I'm useless in certain ways. And then I have this information that makes no sense why I've retained it, but I can walk through houses and I can see every single thing in the room. Yeah, it's odd, but yeah, cinema has that it has that magic. When I watch something like The Passion of Joan of Arc, I just like I can't I feel like I'm staring at something celestial or something. Like the Catholic in me just comes to the forefront. It's like this is something magical or supernatural going on.
You mentioned earlier there voices that trouble you in the middle of the night, and that that you have to go write that. What will you turn to next? Are you working on something, or do you know?
Yeah, so yeah, I've got 2 unpitchable pitches that I'm working on.
You really don't help yourself, do you?
I can't. I wish it was different. I wish, I'd love to just be able to write a book about, people having relationships in universities, but unfortunately, I'm condemned to write oblique, nebulous nonsense. But yeah, I've got a number of projects that I'm working on. There's a few that are long term, like this, the architecture of tyranny idea, and I've actually approached the university about maybe doing that, not as a book, but as a study, like a master's or a PhD or something. But I was working on a script about the Spanish Armada in Ireland, so that I may come back to that. But the 2 pitches I'm thinking of at the minute, there's one that just has a working title, Metropolis, which is about, it's kind of like a real cities as opposed to imaginary cities. And it's loosely based on my experiences around cities, but it's the idea of cities have made us, they've kind of broken us, and now they have to kind of save us from what we've done to ourselves. So that's one idea, and I've done an awful lot. It's inspired by Anna Akhmatova, actually, or Akhmatova, whatever way you pronounce it, who I'm obsessed with. And the other one's called Light in Ruins, which is a book about what happens when you go beyond atheism. It's all about, the subtitle is like searching for God in a God-forsaken world. So it's very much like a kind of book about being a lapsed Catholic, being militantly atheist as a young man, then kind of going beyond that into this strange place where religion has this curiosity, but I can't believe it. So a very odd, intense agnosticism, or Christian existentialism, I've heard it called. But and again, that's a book that travels around the world as I have, and gone to holy places and God-forsaken places. So 2 wandering kind of books, one cities and one about faith or the lack of faith. 2 of the hardest books that you could possibly try and sell in today's climate. So I've created a mountain again for myself. But yeah, if we manage to pull it off, and if there's people interested in reading it, which I think there could be, and we get a publisher who's prepared to have a degree of nerve, I think they could be one really good. But yeah, I mean, maybe the script. There's something in all these ideas, but with the way I operate, I don't know what form they'll take. They might be a book, they might be a website, they might be the rest of my life just wandering. I don't know, but if we can manage to build some kind of structure to contain them in, that would be wonderful.
You almost have this library of Babel of abandoned projects already, don't you? Is it infantry you talk about it in, or is it?
There was there was. I think I spoke to Andrew Galax about it one time. He's a great guy.
Yeah, I think there's a bit in the book as well.
Is there?
Tarot cards in books and novels on, yeah.
I did want to write, like a kind of like a library that was all the books I tried to write and didn't, and like a memoir. Each chapter would be a different book, because I have about at least a dozen books that never came out, and most of them finished. And that would be really interesting. I would see that would be something I'd love to do for like Fitzcarraldo editions or something eventually. But it just seems premature, because I know there's lots and lots of books I'm going to fail to write between then and now. So I'm going to work in that library, going to chalk up some great masterpieces that failed. But in the meantime, I'm going to try and, I don't know, just see where they lead and see what starts to write itself. So I usually work on about 3 or 4 things at the same time, and one of them will just become sentient and start taking over everything, taking over my whole life, and wrecking it in the process. So we'll see which one wins the race. Well,
we'll all look forward to that. We're coming up on time now, so I think that's a good spot to end on. Thank you, Darran, for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Susan.
It's a pleasure. Thank you to Maynooth University for hosting us, to Tracy O'Flaherty for doing the tech, and Una Frawley, who oversees the programme at Maynooth. Thanks a million. Thank you.
Bye.